Welcome to dot point F1, which is the first one in the farming for the 21st century option topic. So what we need to do is discuss issues related to research and development, which we're going to shorten to R&D, research and development of technologies, including funding sources, patents, plant breeders' rights, animal welfare, legislation, and contracts. So remember, this is an including dot point, so we need to look at all 6 of these. Now, basically, research and development leads to new technologies being invented. And so we come up with new ways of doing things by looking into problems and coming up with solutions to fix them. And that's therefore new technology is created to fix those problems. So the reason we do it is because it leads to an increase in increased efficiency. And so that means we're basically getting more outputs with less inputs. And it helps us to feed the world in the future, for example, with all the extra food we need to provide. So there's a number of issues around research and development. So funding sources is talking about where the money comes from and what the problems are with that. We're going to talk about securing rights to the intellectual property that you develop through patents and plant breeders' rights. We're also going to talk about animal welfare issues when you're doing research, legislation, laws to do with research, and also contracts. So if we start off with funding sources, now you can't do research without funding. Obviously, you need people to have an income while they're doing research, but also you need funding to be able to pay for various things that you are using when you do research. And so funding comes from one of 2 sources usually, or maybe a combination of both. And first of all, the public or the government provides funding for a lot of research, and this is done through universities and CSIRO mostly. And basically, the government will help fund research in those areas, but also some businesses can get grants from the government to do research. And usually, the government gives grants if it's in the public benefit. So not stuff that's going to lead to a company making lots of money, but it's going to lead to greater health or economic outcomes for people in the whole country. On the other hand, you might have private sector funding. So different companies such as Commonwealth Bank, for example, might sponsor research because they either think it's a good idea or it's going to be beneficial for them in some way. Or companies like Delaval, which is a robotic dairy company. They're a private company that might fund research, which we'll look at here shortly. Then you can also have a combination of government and private. And this positive case study here is exactly what we're talking about with a combination. So at Sydney University, we went on excursion to see the robotic dairy down there, and that is called Future Dairy. And basically that kind of organization is a combination between Delaval, which is a private company, Dairy Australia, which is a kind of industry body, which gets levies from dairy farmers to run and do research and marketing, and also Investment New South Wales, but also University of Sydney, where the actual project is based. So basically all of these people got together, all these companies and organizations, and they realized that basically if they want to improve the Australian dairy industry and make it more competitive with other countries, then they should work together to improve robotic milking systems. And ultimately that's going to benefit all of these people involved. And so they've created a automatic robotic milking system, and it's capable of milking herds with more than 300 cows, so it's quite large scale. And basically it's an unusually close and large scale collaboration between but all the scientists from City Uni, businesses such as Delaval, government provide in Investment New South Wales, and also the industry through Dairy Australia. So in terms of the industry, where does Dairy Australia get its money from? So it gets $28 million from a dairy service levy. So when farmers pay dairy, they have to pay Dairy Australia based on their milk volume. They also get $19 million from the government to do research and development, and they also get money from various private foundations as well. And so basically what's happening here is Delaval has engineers that they've helped given to help with the project. Sydney Uni has scientists, obviously, who are doing research in animal scientists into that side of it. Future Dairy's scientists as well. And then, so there's a combination of all people with different skills from these different organizations. And so this is what we're talking about when we say a private-public partnership of research and development. So in terms of the issues, ethical issues around sources of funding, it's possible if if companies have a particular outcome that they want to seek from research, then if they provide funding, that could be ethically dubious. So, for example, if a large company that was producing genetically modified plants wanted to conduct a study to test whether genetically modified plants were safe or not, and they provided the funding for that, that could be a bit of a conflict of interest, because obviously they want to find out that it is good, and so if they're providing funding for this research, the researchers might feel pressure to provide a particular outcome, which is not good. And so the conflict of interest situation in which financial or other personal considerations have the potential to compromise or bias professional judgment and objectivity. And it's also possible that there could be some personal or financial gain, which could be a negative. So individual conflicts of interest in research could be when someone sets out doing research and they have an idea of what's going to work, or maybe say a researcher has been researching into something and all their life they've found a certain thing, and so they expect that certain thing to continue. They almost, in a way, don't want it to be different because it's might require too much explaining. Researchers could also be overconfident about a particular idea or way that it's going to work. They could also have an over-reliance on a belief held by a special interest group. So they might be part of someone that believes that genetically modified organisms are bad, and so they do some research to find it out, and that might bias their research. Scientists can also rule out data that doesn't support their hypothesis, which can also lead to distortions, and then you get internal or external pressures from either within the research team or from outside as well. And so you can get bias from how questions are framed, the choice of the design of the research, which is standardization, randomization, replication, and control, the selection of research participants, how the data is collected, analyzed, interpreted, and ultimately published, all affect the outcomes of the science. Financial conflicts of interest happen when you have financial arrangements with sponsors to provide a specific result or outcome, and it's obviously bad. The National Science Foundation has regulations called Responsibility of Applicants for Promoting Objectivity in Research, which is meant to allow science to be unbiased and not influenced by money from different areas. And so different institutions have different standards and procedures when it comes to science to try and ensure that the science is fair and unbiased. So in terms of a negative issue related to funding, basically the government funds research and development into both Australian agriculture but also overseas agriculture. And so if the government's like increasing aid money to research and development in Australia for other countries but decreasing research and development for Australia, that could have a negative impact on people's perception of funding and research. So for this, I want you to write what you think are some positive things around funding and some negative things around funding for that. All right, in terms of patents, so these next two are related. So patents and also plant breeders' rights are related to each other. Now, I've put this Venn diagram here to show you that there is a bit of overlap between patents and plant breeders' rights, but they're not the same thing. So patents are when you come up with a new technology or a new invention, new way of doing things, you can patent that technology, and then you kind of own the rights to that technology for 20 years in Australia, and only you can sell it and make money off it, or you can sell it to other people, but they have to pay you for it. And so that kind of protects your intellectual property, which is written here, or whatever it is that you came up with, your invention, your technology. It can be patented. Now, the difference with plant breeders' rights is living things cannot be patented. So you can patent maybe a new technique to create plants or to create genetically modified plants, but you can't patent living organisms yet. The only exception is you can patent genetically modified organisms because they're considered not natural, or they've had something done to them that is not able to be done naturally. They are considered able to be patented, but anything else that's living cannot be patented. So when we're talking about new plant plant varieties that are not genetically modified, they're just a new variety of something, you can apply for plant breeders' rights for that. And that gives you, again, 20 years with plant breeders' rights as well, when you have exclusive rights to sell and make money off that new variety of plant that isn't genetically modified. So that's the difference. This is not being able to patent living things except genetically modified organisms. And this is basically being able to patent plants, new varieties of plants that are not genetically modified, but we call that plant breeder rights. So like I said, there's significant overlap, and what we're talking about here is when someone does come up with a new technology or a new way of doing things from research and development, they'll often either patent it or put plant breeders' rights on it. And so patents are a limited right based on a claim that a new technological invention has been created and fully communicated to the public. And it doesn't cover ideas or theories, but it's intended to cover specific technical solutions that have some practical application. So you can't, for example, patent a time machine because it hasn't been made yet. You can only patent things that actually exist that you've created. And so in general, raw products of nature are not patentable. DNA products usually become patentable when they have been isolated, purified, or modified to produce a unique form found in nature. In other words, they've been genetically modified. So in terms of patents and plant breeding, they need to have it needs to be genetically modified, as we said, Roundup Ready, genetically modified cotton or canola. In this case, the patent is held by Monsanto, and that can happen because it's genetically modified. Anything that's not genetically modified needs to have plant breeders' rights instead. Okay, so discuss issues. Some scientists that do a lot of research are worried about patenting things because it means that scientists have to pay money to be able to access it, which means that things won't be able to be used as much to then further even more research into other areas. But basically, the reason that we do patent things is because it assumes that people wouldn't want to invest money in research and development if they couldn't make money in return. And if anyone could use their invention, they wouldn't be able to make much money out of it, which would lead to less research and development and less technologies. So basically, it provides a strategy for protecting inventions without secrecy. So if there wasn't any patents, the only way of protecting your invention would be to pretend it hadn't happened, to not tell anyone about it. But then you couldn't make money off it, you couldn't sell it. Other people would work on trying to come up with the same solution or a solution to the same problem, and they wouldn't realize that anyone had already solved that problem. And so there'd be a lot of waste of time and energy and effort. And so in most parts of the world, including Australia, you get 20 years exclusive rights to that product or that thing you've invented, and no one else can make it, use it, or sell it without asking you and also paying you whatever you choose. So what are some of the arguments for? Like I said, it rewards people who make discoveries, and then they can use that money to further more research. And the investment of resources is encouraged by providing a monopoly to the inventor and prohibiting competitors from making, using, or selling it without asking them. So you get duplication of effort is not wasted. So you don't have people trying to reinvent, a smartphone or something like that. Like that has already been invented and trying to solve another problem, but they'll come up with their own one maybe. But you don't have people working on the same problem that's already been solved. They move on to new areas to solve things that haven't been yet, hence this next point here. And so also there's less secrecy. In terms of the problems or against it, it could impede development by third parties because they can't use the technology for 20 years without paying for it. It increases the costs, and the cost of the patents are going to be passed on to consumers. Because patent applications remain secret until granted, companies may work on developing a product only to find that the new patents have been already granted to someone else, and that might have caused them licensing costs along the way. And then lastly, patent holders are being allowed to patent part of nature in the case of genetically modified organisms, which is a basic constituent of life, and it allows one organism to own all or part of another organism, which is maybe a bit of an ethical or moral question. So what I want you to do here is you should make your own summary of the positives and negatives of patents before you move on. So plant breeders' rights, as discussed before, they're very similar in a lot of ways to patents, and plant breeding is developing new varieties through the transfer of desirable traits from parents to offspring, and it's usually given for a period of 20 years. So you might come up with a new variety that is not genetically modified, it's just been selectively bred by you, and you can therefore get plant breeders' rights over it. And they're granted to a new variety. It has to be a distinct new variety, and you're given the rights over the propagating material, so the seed cuttings, divisions, tissue culture, and also the harvested material, such as the flowers, fruit, foliage, etc. So in terms of plant breeding and genetically modified organisms, basically, I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit, but you normally are breeding in things like disease resistance, high yields, better quality, etc. And so regulators around the world have generally taken a cautious approach to deciding about the safety of new varieties for human consumption, and many countries now have plant breeders' rights for new plant varieties. And so without having this period of exclusive rights of plant breeder rights and patents, anyone would be able to sell your new technology without having to pay you for it. And this, of course, would result in little incentive to produce new varieties. This is just a little bit of information here about GMOs. So basically the government regulates GMOs through the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. And at the moment, there's no genetically modified animals or plants in direct human consumption other than oils or cotton and things like that. And so they want to try and protect the safety and health of people and the environment. And we need to test those things before we use them on a larger scale. And so it is mandatory for genetically modified foods to have labels to show that they're genetically modified so people can choose their own foods. So basically, plant breeders' rights, you need to give a positive and negative here about having plant breeders' rights. There might be a little bit of overlap there with patents. Moving on to animal welfare. So when you're carrying out research and development on animals, you have to consider the welfare of the animals. So welfare is a legal obligation of all people in regards to all animals in all situations. And of course, you can get financial penalties, you can get arrested, and you can go to jail if you continuously break animal welfare laws, because all animals need to be protected, and they are according to the law. However, obviously when we're doing research, especially if we're testing new pain relief methods or something like that, basically some of the laws might need to be broken. For example, it's illegal to mules or sheep over 12 months old. However, maybe we want to try a new anesthetic on a sheep, 12 to 18 months old. If we mules them at that age, that might be a consideration. And so to do that, you would actually have to break welfare laws. And so what you can do if you're doing research is you can get exclusions or exemptions from welfare laws for a specific time, for specific reasons, for specific purpose, in specific situations. And basically the way that happens is each university or research place has an animal welfare ethics committee. And for example, at Sydney University, there's the Animal Ethics Committee, and they're basically committed to supporting ethical conduct of people's work with animals, and they will review people's proposals for research on animals, and they will then allow things to happen if they're justified and also scientifically worthwhile. And so they'll say, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do that, you need to do it under these circumstances and only for this long, and they'll give conditions that animal welfare laws can be broken in this case. But of course, people, if they do break animal welfare laws, then they can potentially go to jail. Okay, so animal welfare laws. So there's some information here which I won't read out about animal welfare in research, which you can read, but basically it covers all live, non-human vertebrates and higher order invertebrates. And so in terms of discussing issues, all animals everywhere in New South Wales are protected by the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act from 1979, and animals used for teaching and research, such as in schools, are covered by the Animal Research Act of 1985. And so this system is one that requires accreditation, licensing, and authorization. And basically, in terms of schools, the Department of Prime Ministries and the Department of Education has the School Animal Care and Ethics Committee, and they authorize different schools to do certain activities on animals. So every school, the responsibility of the welfare of animals in that school is the responsibility of the principal or the headmaster, and they designate that responsibility to a person in the school who looks after animal welfare called the Animal Welfare Liaison Officer. And if you go to the Animals in Schools website, you'll notice that there's 5 different categories, and these are different categories of activities. There's far more examples on the website, but basically anything in category 1, such as observation of animals, can be done by anyone without any real training, because it's pretty harmless to the animals, such as observing them. Once you get up to category 2, you need some training and instruction, and that's like mustering, measuring body weight, etc. Activity 3 needs the approval of the Animal Welfare Liaison Officer, and that's things like measurement of different feeding rations, taming and tethering. And then category 4, it must be justified by the syllabus, and you have to write to the school's Animal Care Ethics Committee and get approval before you do it. Examples of injections and shearing. And then lastly, category 5, these are more harmful to the animals: collection of blood and feces, slaughter and mulesing. The teacher must have accreditation, and then they also need to write to the school's Animal Care Ethics Committee. So I'll get you here to summarize in your own words the positives and negatives around animal welfare in research. All right, in terms of legislation, there are laws around research that say the way in which research should take place. And so obviously laws are basically in place to protect the environment, the producer, animal, plant species, inventor, organization, and the public. And they deal with animals, land use, environmental rules, but also food products when it comes to research. And so the Australian Research Council is like a federal statutory authority as part of the federal government, and they say what you should and shouldn't do when it comes to research. And basically national laws around research are meant to protect matters of national significance. So Australian research must comply with the national principles of management for publicly funded research. So when the government gives money for research, they expect research to be conducted in a particular way, in the best kind of way, so that there's actual good outcomes and people aren't just getting money for poor research. So people want to know that research is conducted well and responsibly. So research should comply with the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research, and then anything involving humans or animals needs to comply with the National Health Medical Research Council codes and the National Statement on Ethical Conduct and Human Research. And so what happens if you break the law? You can get investigated and potentially, again, fines or jail term in terms of breaking the law around research, especially with public money. So here you should write some positives and negatives about legislation in terms of research. So the last one here is contracts. So basically this is important when companies go into partnership maybe with a university, and the example we talked about before was the Delaval, Future Dairy, Dairy Australia, Sydney University partnership on coming up with new robotic milking machines. That would be an example of where a contract would have been agreed on before they started. And the reason is because when research and development is going on, there could be some disagreement about who should put money in, how much they should put in, who should put in people to do the research, and then anything that the research comes up with, any technologies that are going to be sold and make money, who actually owns that and who benefits from that. All these things need to be put into a contract so that they can know what's going to happen, and it's very clear, and so it tries to avoid disputes. And so in terms of benefits and concerns, these are just general talk about contracts here, but who is going to benefit in what way. If you have a contract, it's very clear what happens with research and any inventions and how much each different party makes as a result of that, and who might be able to take the findings to do more research and who can't. So the problems are obviously around the legal cost of getting contracts sorted, but if the contract isn't adhered to, you've then got to take the person to court or the company to court to kind of enforce the contract. So there's issues around that as well. So here you should summarize the positives and negatives around contracts. In terms of past questions, I've put the marking scheme down here for you as well, but this is an example answer for patents and plant breeders' rights from 2015. Describe the role of patents and plant breeders' rights in the research and development of new technologies. Patents and plant breeders' rights, or PBRs, have overlapping but also unique functions. Patents allow an inventor to register a new invention, technique, technology, and benefit from it financially or exclusively for 20 years. Whilst naturally occurring genes cannot be patented, GMOs, or genetically modified organisms which have been created, can be patented, example BT cotton. Technologies such as milking robots can also be patented. This encourages people and companies to invest in research and development as they can make a return on their investment. And number two, similarly, plant breeders' rights give breeders rights for 20 years over plant genetics for non-GMO plants, including exclusivity over propagating material, seeds and cuttings, and harvested material, cut flowers and fruit, allowing breeders to receive a return on their research and development investment, and hence encourage research to improve genetics and variety. This question from 2013, the marking scheme, is also here below. Discuss issues related to the research and development of future farming technologies. So I made it very clear here, number 1 and number 2, because it says issues. So the first one is funding sources. So all research and development requires funding, and getting this can be challenging. The government provides much of the funding for R&D through places like unis and CSIRO. However, if a company provides funding for research and they have a vested interest in a particular outcome, this can become ethically dubious and put pressure on researchers for particular results. Example, Monsanto funding research on safety of GMOs. There's a potentially ethically dubious relationship there if they were to do that, for example. Number 2, animal welfare. All people must follow animal welfare laws. However, to conduct research, example into pain relief for mulesing over 12 months, laws may need to be broken. University animal ethics committees or school animal care and ethics committees can give approval for animal welfare laws to be suspended for specific times for specific purposes for the sake of research, and breaking this can lead to fines or jail time.